Everyone, welcome to chapter 14, Mongols part 2. So in chapter 13 we talked about the rise of the Mongols, Genghis Khan, and how he took the nomadic Mongols from the Mongol steppes in Central Asia, unified them, and then conquered China, followed the Silk Road, right, followed trade, and then built the largest land empire the world has ever seen, basically conquering all the way to the fringes of Eastern Europe, and then he dies. And so where we're picking up is what happens when a great leader dies, right? Everybody wants to know who's next. And as is very typical in history, we see this with Alexander the Great, we see this with religious leaders, we saw this with Islam and stuff like that. Things kind of fall apart when the leader dies, and then things kind of become fragmented, whether that be the religion or the empire or things like that. So the Mongols will fragment into three major parts, okay, after Genghis Khan's death. So when they unify as a people under Genghis Khan, they start with China because China really was the crown jewel. They were the most accomplished civilization in all of East Asia, in all of Asia, really. And then they followed the Silk Road, wanting to control trade. So trade was their #1 focus. And then as they expanded along there, controlling trade, that becomes their major focus. So what we're going to look at is what happens after that, okay? And we're going to really focus in East Asia. What happens in East Asia? So we'll touch a little bit on the Ilkhan and the Golden Horde. So the Ilkhan was in the Middle East, which became an Islamic Mongol empire. And then the Golden Horde, like present-day Turkey, so kind of northern Middle East, present-day Turkey, Black Sea, who will be tributaries of Russia, right? Russia will be a tributary of theirs, will also be Islamic, okay? So these two will continue to be Mongol, different religions, but we're going to kind of look at like the core or the key, which will be the Yuan dynasty in this chapter, okay? So you're going to want to have the PowerPoint if you can print it off or take notes, and you're going to want to have your questions, okay? So what is the key or the main dates for this chapter? The main dates for this chapter are 1200 to 1500 CE. And geographic location, we're really looking at Eastern Asia, okay? So China, Korea, Japan, but Eastern Asia. Key civilizations, we're looking really at East Asia, so we're looking at the Yuan dynasty and we're looking at the Ming dynasty in China. We're looking at Japan, and we're looking at the Goryeo in the Goryeo dynasty in Korea. So you have Yuan, Ming, Goryeo, and then Japanese, the Kamakura, and we will look a little bit at Vietnam, but you don't necessarily have to put down a civilization for that. Okay, so as you can see, before Genghis Khan's death, okay, they're going to unify and conquer most of Asia. And then after his death, okay, we're going to see things really break up. Kublai Khan, who is going to be a descendant of Genghis Khan, all right, his grandson, is going to control most of East Asia. And this will become known as the Yuan dynasty. So if you're singing the Chinese dynasty songs, okay, Sheng Zhou Qin Han, Sheng Zhou Qin Han, Sui Tang Song, Yuan, that's where we're at, okay? So in the last time we talked about the Chinese dynasties, we finished off with the Tang dynasty. So remember, we had that warring period after the Han. We had the Sui dynasty who had reunified them, who had started the Grand Canal, but because they were so ambitious, they failed pretty quickly. Then the Tang dynasty took over. We saw Buddhism incorporated about halfway through the Tang dynasty. They will turn on Buddhism because the unthinkable happened, right? Right around 800 CE, and that was Wu Zhao, right? The first female empress, like, oh my gosh, how could this happen? So that pure Confucius society will really take root, and we'll see kind of a turn against that. And then for really the 800s, 900s, the latter half of the Tang going into the Song dynasty, we'll see pure Confucianism really take over, and more an internal focus in China. Now, due to this internal focus and this pure Confucian focus, technology, education will become, artistic ability will become the major focus, and military will become neglected. As a result of that, the Tang dynasty was very militaristic, but the Song dynasty was not. So from 900 to 1200, we're going to see the military capacity of China decline, which makes them susceptible to invasion. So when the Mongols come along in the mid-1200s, okay, with Genghis Khan and stuff like that, if it had been during the Tang dynasty in the 800s, 900s, Mongols probably wouldn't have been able to conquer China. They would have been too fierce. But because the Song dynasty was so internally focused, and topple that with the fierce fighters that the Mongols were, This is going to be a recipe for disaster for China, and the unthinkable will happen. And for the first time in their history, they will be conquered by an outside entity. So for the first time in history, we have a dynasty that is not Chinese led, and that is the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty. So the biggest thing you want to remember about the Yuan dynasty, it's Mongol led. And you have to understand for the Chinese how offensive this is, okay? Hell is frozen over. This is like having a skunk in the house for them. This is think about how people feel about President Trump. Either people love President Trump or they hate President Trump. But either way, in 2016, when President Trump won, it was shocking for everyone. Even President Trump didn't think he was going to win. The polls didn't show it. It was truly shocking. Okay, the polls didn't show it, and so it's not for or against him. It's just it was not predicted, and so it was shocking when he won. And so in the same way, the Chinese are just shocked that this could even happen. How does this happen? How does a Mongol take over the Chinese? We are the Chinese. We are prestigious. No one is better than us. We are more advanced. We are civilized. How does a barbaric, smelly Mongol take us over? Well, militarily, that's how. And so then for the next while, 100 years or so, they will be controlled by the Yuan dynasty. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about the Ming. So the Yuan dynasty is going to be from 1280 to 1365, and again, this will be led under Kublai Khan, okay, which is a descendant of Genghis Khan. It's also during this time that Marco Polo from Italy will visit in the Yuan dynasty, and he'll spend about 20 years with Kublai Khan visiting and observing them and their technologies and their advancements, and then when he goes back to Italy, he'll take things like coal, gunpowder, noodles, these ideas with him. He's going to write one of the most best-selling books in Europe. So when we get to the Renaissance and the printing press becomes a thing, the Bible, second only to the Bible, will be Marco Polo's travels, which will inspire the exploration age. And it's during the Mongol rule of China that we see this happen. Now, if Marco Polo had visited China during a different era, he probably wouldn't have been welcome. He probably wouldn't have had the inside scoop that he had. And so the timing of it was really interesting that he was able to take back these technologies like gunpowder, like noodles, like coal, which will have such a huge influence in Europe. So we've talked about this before. What does Mongol invasion look like, right? There's three options when the Mongols are coming. Surrender. Well, guess what? Then they're actually not too bad. They set up a tributary most of the time. They're very tolerant. And because they lack culture, right, they culturally diffuse with you. So that is why we see, for instance, in the Yuan dynasty, where it says Empire of the Great Khan, that'll become the Yuan dynasty, they will adopt Confucianism and Buddhism. We'll see the Golden Horde, again, up here around the Black Sea, which Russia will become a tributary there. They will become Islamic. We'll see the Ilkhan Empire become Islamic, okay? This one in Central Asia, don't worry so much about them, okay? But what we'll see is that we'll have this branching after Genghis Khan's death. We'll see a branching of the empire, but we'll see different religions. So they're all Mongol, but we'll see them culturally develop in very different ways because they regionally adapt to where they are, because they themselves lack culture due to their nomadic roots. They were good at one thing, moving around and fighting. So once they found somewhere to settle down, they were more than happy to take on the cultural practices of those they conquered. As long as you gave in, right? Because if you chose option 2 or 3, it was death. What were they known for? Their ponies, right? We talked about this in chapter 13. They were known for their ponies. They could go up to 100 miles a day. Their bow and arrows would go further than, a good 20% farther than their enemies. And they were just super savage. It was surrender or die, truly. And even in the short video that you watched, women would commit suicide because they were known for raping and pillaging. I mean, they were very, very savage. So their reputation was warranted. And their saddles are something that really they became known for because they would travel such long distances. Now, this is obviously a very beautiful saddle with gold and stuff, so this wouldn't be their typical saddle. This would be someone very wealthy or, a Khan or something like that for parade or kind of showing off wealth. But their style of saddle is actually look very reminiscent of the Western style of saddle that we see horse riders and stuff use today. And this will be important because when you're riding long distances, people who ride across country and things like that, Western saddles will be modeled after this, which are very practical for long distance travel. Genghis Khan was very straightforward with his laws, and it was very ruthless. So to give you an example, if you do not pay homage, meaning your taxes, you will pay with your prosperity. okay? Meaning your money. If you do not have prosperity, money, you will pay with your children. If you do not have children, you will pay with your wife. If you do not have a wife, we will take your head. So the reality is that you paid up. The Mongols were really, in every essence of the word, you do it or you don't, okay? You do it or it's death. There was no getting away with things. And because of this brutal tactic, they were able to have such a vast empire. Because of their brutal tactics, people tended to surrender and not push the boundaries. So we're going to focus then a little bit on China, okay? So the Yuan dynasty or empire from 1279 to about 1380, okay, is going to be ruled under Kublai Khan. So he'll be declared the Great Khan, and then he will found the Yuan dynasty when he conquers China, all right? And they will move the capital city to Beijing. Now, like I said, they will culturally diffuse to the Chinese. So they will bring with them their fighting styles, but other than that, they were all about incorporating and doing what the Chinese did, okay? So they will incorporate Buddhism, they will incorporate Confucianism, but here's what they will do. They will practice it loosely, okay? So I've given the example before, like for instance with Christianity, there's many different types of Christians, right? There's the two-fers who go only on Christmas and Easter. There's the people who maybe go once a month or kind of here and there. And then there's the people that are dedicated every single Sunday, Bible study on Wednesdays, you know what I mean? It's incorporated to every facet of their life. I would describe the Mongols as two-fers. Okay, so if you're looking at their dedication to Confucianism, how dedicated were they to true Confucianism? They were two-fers. They practiced it here and there, but they were very loose about their practices. So the pure Confucius society of the Song dynasty, the true cultural roots of the Chinese, was very compromised, okay? Very, very compromised. The civil service exam will be put aside. This respect, accepting one's place, social hierarchy, the scholarly gentry, all those things will kind of be put aside or become really loose. And because their main focus was trade, merchants will actually rise up in social classes, which remember in traditional society, merchants are seen as selfish because they're self-seeking, right? They take the work of others and they sell it. And so in a pure Confucius society, this would never be allowed. Yet, because the Mongols are so focused on trade, remember they expanded along the Silk Road, this is something that we will see loosened. So when I say that they adopted and they culturally diffused, they did this, but they weren't the true dedicated practice that the Chinese obviously would uphold. So we do see Chinese, during the Yuan dynasty, it's kind of two parts for China. Economically, they thrive, but culturally, they fall apart, okay? Which for the Chinese is the worst thing that could happen. They could kind of care less about the economic side. They are absolutely devastated to see their culture compromised. It is during this time, though, that we would consider it the Pax Mongolica. Okay, this is the height of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan never really got to rule his empire. He was so busy spreading and conquering, okay? So it's really after his death that we see the real success of the Mongol Empire through trade. And so even though it fragments, the Yuan dynasty, the Il Khan, and the Golden Horde will trade with one another very peacefully and successfully along the Silk Road. And because they were so tolerant, people could come freely to and from, in and out of China. So this is again when like Marco Polo will visit and is able to bring those technologies out of China. This is when technologies like gunpowder, printing press, compass will travel along the Silk Road into the Middle East and eventually make their way to Europe. And this is really important because this helps set the stage for the Renaissance, for exploration. The backbone of the Renaissance is the printing press. The backbone of exploration is gunpowder and the compass. And these technologies came from the Chinese. So the Chinese created these inventions during the Tang and the Song, but who facilitated the trade? The Mongols. And it's because of this peaceful time of prosperity and trade that this happened. And people like Marco Polo who could go back and forth. Without the Mongols, this technology might have taken a lot longer for things to spread. The Chinese were very wary of outsiders. So it was only because of Mongol rule that outsiders were so welcome. They were more interested in outsiders because they thought that there was more to gain from it, where traditionally the Chinese were very closed off to outsiders. So like I said, Marco Polo is a great example of helping to take the ideas of the Chinese under the Tang and the Song and spread them, and the Mongols facilitate that, okay? So he traveled there and spent roughly 20 years, well, about 15 years, but 20 years total in his travels. And it's funny, when he got back to Italy, he had been gone for so long that people thought that he was a traitor or a tyrant or something like that, and it wasn't until they actually read his notebooks and stuff that they're like, oh, wow, he actually got some cool stuff, and they let him out of jail. So they actually put him in jail for a little while, and then eventually they will take his writings and they will publish a book about his adventures, and it'll become a bestseller, second only to the Bible. And this is when Europe is for the first time introduced to the concept of coal, which will become a huge burning fuel source, gunpowder, which obviously is going to change the face of warfare, and noodles, which, think about it, we when we think of Italy, we think of pasta, right? Which actually they get the idea, the whole concept, from actually the Chinese. So how did he travel? We believe that he traveled probably along the Silk Road and then came back through Indian Ocean trade. So we believe that he probably went through Mediterranean, traveled along the Silk Road, spent his time in the Yuan dynasty, and then traveled back through Indian Ocean trade back through the Middle East. So the Yuan dynasty, their economy was really focused on trade. They practiced tax farming, okay, which, remember, was the privatization of tax collecting, where they would hire a corporation to go and collect taxes for them. So this saved them money, but the problem with it is that it led to overtaxation. So the Yuan, the Ilkhan, and the Golden Horde all practiced tax farming. And this is going to be one of the reasons for their declines, because these private corporations would have a quota to say. So let's say it was 50 bucks a person, let's just say, that they had to pay the Yuan dynasty. But because it was privately done, there was no government oversight, they would tend to over collect. So they would maybe collect $75 a person, and they would pocket that 25. So they're collecting too many taxes. Imagine if your parents had to pay taxes, plus whatever the company that they were paying taxes to decided to collect on top of. So your parents could end up paying a lot of their income, and it could really hurt them economically. And like I said, their cultural diffusion over time is going to help the spreading of these technologies, especially from China. The Chinese under the Song dynasty really progressed in a lot of things, but porcelain is something they're going to become really well known for. And because of the trade of the Yuan dynasty, their popularity of porcelain will make it all the way to the Middle East and Europe. And this is going to kind of become, it used to be they were known for silk. Their number one commodity that everybody's going to want is going to be porcelain, which is this fancy pottery that they will paint that is so intricate. In fact, it'll get the nickname in England, China, because they will use it for tea time, right? And it was this special type of porcelain and pottery that you could only get from China. After the Yuan dynasty, okay, when they fell, the Chinese will take back over, and this will be the Ming dynasty, okay? The Ming is the last Chinese-led dynasty, so I would make note of that. The Ming is the last Chinese-led dynasty. And what's really important to get from this part of the lecture then is the Chinese reaction to Mongol rule is going to set them on a course that is going to hurt them for centuries, okay? They're so concerned with correcting what the Mongols have done that they're going to make devastating decisions that will impact them for centuries to come, all the way really into World War II. And we're going to keep talking about that, what the Ming dynasty does, okay? So the first off thing to note is that this is the last Chinese-led dynasty, so 1368 to 1644. So what were they all about? Their number one focus was about restoring Chinese culture. You have to understand, it's like the analogy I always give in class is the time, so I grew up in the Northwest where we have a lot of skunks. And if you ever have smelled a skunk, you'll never forget. It only takes once. It's like the worst rotten egg, but worse, okay? So I had a chocolate lab growing up, and we grew up around these kind of woods, and we would let her out at night sometimes to go potty, and she loved skunks. And so once in a while she'd get the scent of one and she'd run after one, and her name was Lady. We'd be like, Lady. And I'll never forget that sometimes she would get lost out in the woods, and my mom would be like, go get her. We'd call her, and because she was chocolate and it was like dusk, it would be hard to see her. So you'd see her like glowing eyes, coming out of the forest finally. And I'll tell you, the couple times that she got skunked, so what would happen is she'd go up to the skunk, right? She'd sniff at the butt, and the skunk would get mad and spray her with that nasty smell that it takes weeks to get rid of. So that dog would come running back at us, and before she was 20 feet from us, we could smell her. We'd be like, oh no! And we would go running in the house. So I'll never forget the time she comes running in the house, and we had left the door open, and she comes in the house, and my mom is screaming, "Get the dog out of the house," because she had been sprayed by this skunk, and so our whole house smelled like a skunk, like this horrible rotten egg, and she's just rubbing on everything, and this is like the worst smell. It's like throw up, like you can't get rid of it. You know what I mean? That smell, it's just absolutely toxic. There's only one way to get rid of it. So when this would happen, my dad would get so bad, he'd be like, "Oh my gosh," and stuff. So we would keep, because this would happen a couple times a year, we would keep in bulk in the garage tomato juice, okay, like raw tomato juice you get like from Costco. We keep flats of it. So I never forget, my dad would go and put his rain gear on, okay, because he'd have to bathe her in this. So he'd go put the leash on her, and he'd take her outside, and he'd go get the cans of tomato juice, like big cans of tomato juice or clamato juice, okay, like V8 juice, and just pour it on her and scrub it through her, and then wash it off, and then do it again. And then she'd have to stay outside for at least 4 or 5 days. The tomato juice would take the edge off of it, but it wouldn't quite totally get rid of the stench. She still would have to stay outside for a few days, but it was the only way to help get rid of the stench. A normal bath doesn't get rid of the stench of a skunk. And you have to think about, the reason I give this analogy, okay, this is how the Chinese felt about the Mongols. It's like a skunk had come through China and just stenched them. And so their goal is to do everything they can to cleanse themselves in tomato juice to get rid of the stench. And no matter what you do, you're not going to get rid of it right away. It's going to take time. But they wanted to rid themselves of the feeling of the Mongols. They just were like, oh, like they had the heebie-jeebies, like the Mongols had been here. And so the goal of the Ming dynasty is first and foremost to get rid of the Mongol stench, to get rid of their cultural influence, their cultural practices, and to return back to their true Chinese culture, okay? To undo the damage that the Mongols have done. So here's what they do. They close their borders to foreigners. Okay, no more foreigners coming and going, no more Marco Polos and everybody can welcome and stuff like that. Are you kidding me? And tainting our society. Okay, that's first and foremost. Okay, severed relationships, no more trade, done. They moved their capital from Beijing. So first they moved it to Nanjing. Then they moved it back to Beijing, okay? But they tried to move their capital for a while because they're like, we don't even want to have the same capital that the Mongols had, all right? They returned back to pure Confucianism. So those merchants are going back down to their lower status. They are no longer having higher status. So no more two-for type of Confucius, okay, where it's like, oh, we're kind of loosey-goosey Confucius. No, pure Confucius, civil service exam, scholarly gentry, patriarchal society, to the letter of the law, back to the strict order way of our culture and society. So their goal is to get back to the true practice of what it was and to undo the damage that the Mongols have done, all right? So they close their borders, they, again, get rid of the merchants, they stop trading, and they restore the civil service exam, they restore Confucius learning, they would try to repair their canals, and they even take on a huge ambitious project within the city of Beijing, okay, to build a new palace called the Forbidden City, all right, which was a palace within the palace to restore the eliteness of the emperor, okay? Because they felt like all their government and empire, you know, all of their palaces and stuff were tainted, so they built a whole new one, all right? It took over 1 million workers to build this. And the walls are 26 feet high. Now today you can go visit the Forbidden City, but for a long time this was so reclusive. And it has over 980 different buildings. It took from 1406 to 1420 to build this. And the goal of this was to house the royalty and to restore the eliteness of the pure Confucius. What were some of their accomplishments? They returned back to, they weren't interested in trading more, so they turned back to actually innovating, which is what they were known for, okay? So the printing press got even better. They developed books and paper. They returned, again, back to better education, brought back the civil service exam. Literacy rates will go up. The culture, the arts, they will continue with porcelain, painting, ceramic, opera, poetry. They were less about conquering and trade and more about artistry and education and respectability, okay? That's what they cared about. They will bring back coinage, okay? And so they will start working on coinage. They will use some of the trade from the Spanish, and they will start to develop their own coinage. Here's an example of one, and develop their own currency. During this age, their style of art was more modern, it was softer, it was more graceful, and hundreds of thousands of workers building the Forbidden City. So probably one of their biggest accomplishments during the Ming Dynasty was the building of the Forbidden City. They did keep the tributary systems, okay? So those around them, like with Korea and Japan and things like that, they had tributaries. But they really were not as concerned with conquering as the Mongols were. Their chief voyager was Zhang He. I would know him for the test, and he almost always shows up on the AP exam. He's probably one of the most, besides Christopher Columbus, probably one of the most well-known explorers. Okay, and what's interesting is that even though he is a Chinese explorer, Chinese merchant, he is actually originally from Southeast Asia. He's a Muslim merchant who will be hired by the Chinese, and he's often known as kind of the Chinese Christopher Columbus, okay, so to speak. And so what the Ming Dynasty decided to do was to send him out with these junk ships, or with these treasure fleets, okay, these massive ships. I mean, look at how much bigger they were than the European ships. You can see how large their ships compared to Columbus's original ships. They were massive. So the goal was to go make contact with the Middle East and see, is there anything worth our while in the Middle East that we should want to trade for? So he set out on a series of voyages, and the goal was, does anyone else in the world have something better than we do that's worth our trade? Or is it a bunch of crap and we're wasting our time? So Zhang He did a total of 7 different voyages, and here's basically what was concluded. What was concluded was that they reestablished trade, but over the course of these 7 different voyages that he went out, he traded with different people, brought back different products. Here's basically what the Ming Dynasty concluded. Nothing was worth their time. Nothing was accomplished. Over the 50 voyages, the 50 new tributaries acquired all kinds of different products. Nothing was actually very profitable. What they found was that no one had better products than they did. You can see they set up tributaries all through Southeast Asia, through the Indian Ocean, all the way to East Africa. And what they found was that all the quality of products were less than theirs. It's kind of like girls if we're shopping at Nordstrom's versus Ross. Doesn't mean you can't find some cool stuff at Ross, but Nordstrom's generally is going to have a lot better quality. China was the Nordstrom's of the time. They had the best quality of products, the most advanced quality of products, and everything else failed in comparison. So it wasn't worth their time. So finally, in 1433, they will go into isolation. They suspended all voyages and said, we're done. It's not worth our time. We're not gaining anything from this. And so they stopped all of their voyages, and they go into isolation. So why did they turn their backs on overseas exploration? Well, they did this because no one had anything better than them. They wanted to focus internally on Confucius ideas and Confucius learning. It was costly and it wasn't profitable, but the long-term consequences are going to be, it's kind of like the story of the rabbit and the tortoise, right? The rabbit gets so far ahead that what's the rabbit do in the race? He sits under a tree and he takes a nap. The Ming are so far ahead that they go into isolation in 1433 and they stop paying attention to what the rest of the world is doing. And what's going to happen is that Europe in the 1400s is coming alive. During the Renaissance, exploration is going to start to happen. And like the tortoise, who's been behind all those years, Europe's been in the dark ages, they've been behind, the tortoise is eventually going to catch up with the hare. Europe is going to catch up with China, and China's not even going to see it coming. Why? Because China is asleep under the tree. The hare is asleep under the tree. China is in isolation. And so the analogy I'm trying to give you, this is a big turning point for the Ming Dynasty. They are so focused on restoring their culture and undoing the damage of the Mongols, they lose sight of staying ahead of the game. They think they're so far ahead, nobody will ever catch up with them, that they just go into isolation and they stop caring about the outside world. And by doing that, they're going to make themselves victim to the outside world eventually when we get to the 1800s and imperialism, where it'll be easy for them to be conquered because they're so far behind. When the hare wakes up, right, and realizes he's behind and he rushes to try to win, what happens? The tortoise is so far ahead. So later, we're going to come back to this and this mistake that they are going to make. their technological innovations will actually start to slow because they don't see the competition. You know, when you're competing, there is something about having competition that pushes us to do better. And the problem for them is that because they're not competing, because they're not out there trading, they're not feeling the pressure of other civilizations, they will slow in their technology. And again, because they're so internally focused on reviving Confucianism, that they put more focus on that and less focus on trade. All of their good stuff had already been traded. Things like gunpowder, things like the compass, things like the printing press. Also, the bubonic plague was going through Europe at that time, right? Had already left East Asia, had gone down the Silk Road, and now was in Europe in the 1400s, wiping out about 50% of Eurasia. So they felt like there was really nothing for them to gain because their key number one focus was returning to pure Confucianism, that truly dedicated Confucianism. Here's just some pictures of some of their porcelain vases at the time. I mean, they're absolutely gorgeous, the intricate detail that people would want. Some of their lacquer dishes, and again, the intricate detail, and these things just became prized possessions in Europe. So Ming versus Mongol rule, what was similar? Ming China built itself, on Mongol foundation, political structure and administration, militarily. Okay, but difference-wise, the Mongols were not committed to Confucianism. So as a result of that, trade economically thriving, right? Militarily thriving. The Ming didn't care about that. The Ming closed their borders, cut themselves off, returning to that pure Confucianism, but in doing so are going to set themselves up for several hundred years later to become victims of the West because they will fall behind. Okay, let's talk about Japan for a little bit. Okay, so what's going on with Japan during the Yuan, Ming dynasty? Okay, we know that the Mongols pretty much conquered everybody they came in contact with. Korea will become a tributary of theirs. Vietnam will become a tributary of theirs. But the Mongols are really good at land conquering. Japan is not land. Japan is isolated because it's a series of islands. So what happens when the Mongols come along? Are they going to be able to conquer them? Well, they're going to try. So here comes the Mongols, okay? And this is going to be the worst threat on Japan prior to World War II. So this is going to be the worst invasion or worst threat that Japan is going to face until World War II, when the U.S. will drop the atomic bombs, okay? They were attacked because Kublai Khan demanded a letter. He wanted gold, he wanted pearls, he wanted power. He demanded that they be a tributary, and Japan just didn't really see a need to do that. It's like, well, what are you going to do? You're going to swim across with your ponies? Well, they tried. So there were two separate attempts at invasion, in 1274 and in 1281, okay? And so let's talk about what happened with those two invasions. So the first attempt was in 1274, okay? The first attempt, they sent 900 ships, over 40,000 men, okay? And this could have been really, really bad. Japan was not prepared. They were not prepared for this many men and everything to come over. And surprisingly, though, a huge wind came, okay, this kamikaze wind, divine wind came through and destroyed over 200 of the ships, and 13,000 men perished. And so the Japanese saw this as an intervention of the gods, of Zen Buddhism protecting them, and so this is where the idea of kamikaze kind of comes from within Japan. So they thought that it was the gods looking out for them. After that, Japan then is going to prepare. So the first invasion was a failure not because Japan defeated them, but because of weather. All right, Japan got lucky, or the gods intervened on their behalf. I don't know. Either way, they got lucky, right? The Japanese saw it as the gods intervening for them. All right. Now, before the second one, they prepared. Okay, so they got lucky after the first one, and then they prepared for the second one. For the second one, they built a massive wall. So this stone barrier that you can see, okay, in this picture, they built this massive wall along the coast as a way, because you think about it, anytime you're invading from the coast onto the shore. So you're getting off a ship and you're coming on the shore. You're at a disadvantage. So this wall created a barrier that they could basically fight from behind and attack them. Anytime you're going from from ocean to land or water to land, people on the water have a disadvantage. People on the land have an advantage, right? Because you have the higher ground and the other people are sitting duck coming onto the sand. So they built this massive wall that would help them fight off or keep off the Mongols, okay? And they put up a very, very good defense. So the first time, natural intervention is going to defeat the Mongols, and the second time that they invaded, trying to take over, the Japanese were ready, and they put up a good fight, and the Mongols just couldn't do it. So we learned something. The Mongols are very good at land invasion, but they are not meant for sea. They are not a seafaring people. Vietnam is going to be a little bit of a different story. Vietnam is going to be kind of 50-50, okay? The northern half, which will be more like Laos area, okay, or Amam, is going to be, will fall as a tributary to the Mongols. And then the southern half, Cambodia, okay, which will be more dominantly like champa rice, and stuff like that, will be more influenced by India, will not fall to the Mongols, okay? So the northern part of Vietnam will become a tributary of China and have more Chinese influence and will fall to the Mongols. But the southern half will actually have more influence from India because of trade. There's a story of when the Mongols tried to invade Vietnam. It's a very similar kind of King Arthur and the sword and the stone, that this magical turtle arose from the lake and gave Tron, one of their leaders, an enchanted sword, and this is what helped him to defeat the Mongols, stuff like that. So the Mongols were not able to conquer all of Vietnam, so they were able to set up some kind of tributary, but the Vietnamese were able to hold them off and limit Mongol invasion and control of Vietnam. And eventually, they will, because they are tributaries and have influence from China, they, like other parts of East Asia, will adopt Confucianism, and so we'll see that blending of Buddhism and Confucianism adopted throughout parts of Vietnam. There will be a massive rebellion in 907 that they originally broke away from the Tang, and they will win their independence from the Chinese. And again, we're able to defeat most of the Yuan dynasties, the Mongols' invasion. So some parts of it will become tributaries, but their independence will end, unfortunately, with in the mid-19th century, so it'll be 1800s, with imperialization. When Europeans arrive, they will not be able to hold off. So they have a really long period where they're actually able to hold off being conquered. But Mongol rule, they actually were more successful than a lot of people holding off Mongol influence and Mongol rule. Korea, not so much, okay? The Goryeo dynasty, so the root of the modern name is Korea, okay, which will rule from 918 to 1392, is going to be a tributary of the Tang, and then later the Song, and then later will also be a tributary of the Mongols. Okay, and so they will be probably one of the closest tributaries of China throughout history, is going to be Korea. And so they will culturally diffuse Mongol ideas, just like they did under the Tang and the Song. The Yuan dynasty will be no different. So of all of Japan, of Korea, of Vietnam, and these areas, Korea will the most culturally diffuse with the Mongols and their ideas.